Hey, everybody, welcome back to New Jersey Women for Trump. I am so excited. I have been looking forward to this evening, and I know so many of you have. So I would like to welcome the incredible, my hero, Katie McFarland. Welcome to New Jersey Women for Trump.
It's so great to be with you, Elizabeth. We met at CPAC very briefly, and I'm glad that we have a chance to have a little more in-depth conversation now.
Absolutely. So many people are looking forward to hearing all about your experience. We're going to talk about your book, but I need to give those who may be younger than me a little bit of your background because it's pretty impressive, KT. You are a national treasure, truly. The experience that you have and really a public service legend. I just want to quickly go over it. It could take us an hour to go through the details of your background, but we're talking about 4 administrations. We're talking about Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and most recently Trump, as we all know. Foreign policy expert, national security expert, training at Oxford, MIT, nuclear weapons expert. And in all of that, so many unique people that you worked with, and you're going to share some of that, I'm sure, tonight. But you also raised 5 children, which I think is incredible. I don't know how you fit that in. You talk about chapters of your life, but you managed to have an amazing marriage, 5 children, and what is it, 47 years in Washington all told, or at least a span of that.
In and out. No, I started my career in 1969 as a GW, George Washington University freshman, and then got a job working part-time for Henry Kissinger in the West Wing of the Nixon administration.
Legend. And you've been there really for history. You have seen history. And I think what's amazing about that, you're such a patriot. It brings us to the Trump era. And really, we're going to talk tonight about your book. And everybody, this book, it's called Revolution, and it's called that for a reason. We'll tell you why in a minute. But Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People. And I tell you what, KT, you do an amazing job talking about why Trump happened. And to be clear, you are a Trump supporter, but you're very balanced about it. Why Trump happened, why it needed to happen. And then we're going to get into your story about your own experience with the FBI, and then we need to look forward. So let's start, because there's so much that I want to ask you. So I want you to kind of paint the picture. You do it so well in this book about how we got to the era of Trump. It's this populace versus the elite. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a card-carrying member of the Republican foreign policy establishment elites, right?
Yeah.
And I've been in the Nixon and Ford administration. I was an aide to Henry Kissinger. I had a big job in the Reagan administration. And yet I felt that the United States, and particularly Republicans and Democrats, had really drifted away. And since since before September 11th, but certainly after September 11th, we'd gone in the wrong direction, that we had screwed up the economy, that we were not growing the way we should, that we were completely dependent upon the Middle East for energy, and that we had been so focused on the Middle East that we had lost track of what the real strategic threat to the United States was, which I thought was China.
Yeah.
So I broke with the Republican establishment who were supporting in 2016, who were supporting Jeb Bush and all the traditional candidates. And I broke with them, and I supported Trump because as much as he was uncouth in the foreign policy sense, he didn't go to the Council on Foreign Relations meetings, and he was pretty blunt. But he understood. He said, what have we gotten out of these Middle East wars? And then he also talked about China. And everybody was making fun of him. And I thought, whoa, this guy is different. If he manages to win, he could really change the world. And even if he doesn't win, I'm going to support him because I think he could be a real wake-up call to the Republican Party. So fast forward, he wins. I joined the Trump transition. And I saw how he was able to really break all the China in the China shop. And I thought that was a good thing. A lot of people didn't. People are uncomfortable with that kind of change. I thought it was essential change that had to happen.
Well, you describe it well in the book that certainly the Washington insiders didn't want to see that happen. But before he even won, you describe this need in the country. You say that the average hardworking commoners, maybe the insiders might call them that, right? They turned to Trump, that they felt that they were left behind, that he was picking up on this. And you were also seeing this in the nation. And is that why we all outside of, the Beltway, we reacted so strongly to him and felt as though he represented us, a billionaire representing commoners? That's pretty amazing.
Who would have thought, right? Well, so I had a pretty active public speaking career, and I was going around the country, 2010, 15, and I would go around and I would sort of do my own informal polling. And I would say, how many of you in this room think that the United States economy isn't what it should be, that your kids aren't going to have as good a life as you've had? And maybe a quarter of the hands would go up. And then I say, well, how many of you think that we're being pushed around by everybody in the world? And then, half the hands are up. And then I said, how many of you think that America's lost our way, that those traditional values that we've been raised on of hard work and personal responsibility and integrity and honesty, that they're just frittering away? Well, by then, 3/4 of the people really have their hands raised. And then I asked the clincher question, Elizabeth. I said, and how many of you think this is Washington's fault? Everybody's hand is up at this point, including the guy running the sound machine. And it would happen time after time after time, all across the country. Every group I was talking to, whether it was a women's group, whether it was foreign policy experts, whether it was a corporate board retreat, and they all seemed to feel the same way. Even the people who were benefiting, who were doing really well, the people who should not have a gripe. Right. So I sensed that, well, something really is going on. Yeah. And it was increasingly evident that it was an elite versus the average American thing. And the elites, the expert class, well, they weren't getting it right. I mean, they were not doing the job for the American people, whether it was the people who said, we've got to, just a few more years in Iraq, or, just a couple of $1 trillion more in Afghanistan and we're going to win. Or the people who said, well, we raised these taxes just a little higher. And yet they had ignored the American people. They thought they were experts and they looked down their noses at anybody who didn't agree with them. And I increasingly saw this chasm between the Washington insider expert class, who, by the way, weren't that expert, and then the rest of the country, which has an enormous amount of common sense, the rest of the country saying, look, you're not getting the job done. And we want to get rid of you. We want somebody who will get the job done. And I don't think that was a political Republican versus Democrat, conservative versus liberal. I think it was just a natural national reaction of a lot of Americans with an enormous amount of common sense looking at the so-called expert class and saying, these guys may have all the fancy degrees, but man, they're not getting it right.
No, they didn't. And, you talk about in the book why populism and nationalism is a good thing. And, those words can be used in a negative way, but talk about why you think that's a good thing and how that fit into what Donald Trump was telling us, the America First, how he was relating to the voter.
Look, in foreign policy, if any leader is not putting the interests of his own people first, he's committing foreign policy malpractice. Yeah. So yes, America should put its interests first. And yet America really, since, for the last 20 or 25 years, had not. It had been putting the interests of other nations first, or the global community first. And it was sacrificing a lot of the American people. I mean, for example, we built up China, right? A lot of that was that we gave them favorable trade terms, we gave them favorable investment terms, and manufacturing moved from the American Midwest to China. So we were sacrificing our own people and our own livelihoods to give something to build up China. Well, we were not putting America's interests first. And then I think the other part of it was this sort of snobbery. I mean, to me, one of the biggest problems in America historically has always been that maybe 40% of the people didn't vote. They thought, well, I'm not political. They may have had opinions, but they never would show up at the polls. Right. And so I thought that the more people who got involved and the more commonsensical people, i.e. the people out of Washington, then we would get into the right track. But then the people in Washington, they don't like the rest of the country telling them what to do. They think they're much smarter than everybody. Right. And even if they're not getting it right, they're convinced. They may be wrong. What is the expression? They may be wrong, but they're not confused. Right, they're sure they're right. Yeah. And so the disdain with which they looked at the rest of the country. And so America First, I think that's nationalism. I think nationalism is a good thing because if you don't put your people's interests first, then, you really shouldn't even be in governance. And then the populism part, to me, populism isn't, people screaming. I mean, they're painted as sort of white, racist, supremacists, all white males, right? Right. And yet, populism to me is the most pure form of democracy. Populism means the people govern. You know, the
Yeah.
history of the world, we have a lot of different kinds of government. So there's an oligarchy or a monarchy or a religious caliphate. But in America, it's where the people vote, and we have the right to do it. We have, I think it's a God-given right to
Yeah.
determine our own destiny. And certainly our founding fathers
That's right.
expected us to govern ourselves. And that's populism.
Yeah, absolutely. It's part of the nature of who we are, the fabric of how we were created. So one of the things that you talk about that you just mentioned before is you were impressed by the fact that President Trump picked up, then candidate Trump picked up on the fact that China was the issue, that Obama wasn't focusing on that. And you say often that you were impressed that he picked up on that. What was it about that you think he figured out? Was it the unfair trade practices? Why did he happen to focus on China more so than previous administrations?
I think as a businessman, he was looking at it from a very different light.
Yeah.
That this couldn't go on. The United States was continuing to have deficit spending, borrowing from other countries, borrowing from ourselves, but also borrowing abroad. Also, a large part of our major foreign creditor is China. I mean, they're the foreign country that owns the most American debt. And that the Chinese, because we gave them these favorable trade agreements, that they were going to eventually outstrip us economically, whether it was through our help or the stuff that we weren't helping them with, they were stealing. And so he understood that the trajectory could not continue. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in fairness to the smarty pants expert class, they looked at the way America had governed itself since the end of World War II was that we looked after World War II was over, we emerged strong, right? We had not been damaged. Our society was great. Our economy was intact. And we looked at all the countries around the world, Europe and in Asia, that had been devastated, including our enemies. And we rebuilt them. We said, okay, we're going to, at our expense, we're going to rebuild your economies. We're going to rebuild your societies. You're going to be great trading partners with us and allies. We also said, we're going to pay for your national security against the communists. We're going to underwrite that too. And then we're all going to be secure. And it worked. You know, Europe is now, you know, a lot of ways, even a stronger competitor in a lot of ways than we are. Yeah. So we rebuilt Europe. We rebuilt Japan. We rebuilt Korea. And it worked. And then when China came along, we said, oh, we're going to do the same thing for China. We're going to modernize China, help them at our expense again. And then they're going to turn around to have an open society and an open economy, just like all these other countries have done. And the Chinese, thank you very much, America, but we have no intention of being like everybody else. We're China. And Trump understood it while, you know, the rest of official Washington was saying, well, it's Al-Qaeda, it's ISIS, or it's Russia. Trump understood, because of the economic threat that China posed, that it was always going to be China.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, let's move to the transition for a moment, because China wasn't the thing in the transition. It was Russia. As it turns out, that was the story, right? So the campaign, you know, you were involved in the campaign a little bit. And then, of course, we have this amazing victory that no one predicted. Well, some did, but the pundits did it. And you become part of the transition team. You become the Deputy National Security Advisor under General Flynn. Now, again, the book, and everybody, you've got to read this book, because it's going to fill in the gaps that you weren't seeing in the news. And it's a fascinating retelling of the story. So Katie, I want you to get into the transition and describe what it was like for you, somebody who has an amazing amount of experience in Washington. I think you said at one point you were the only person who literally had been in the West Wing. You had to draw it out for them. Explain what this was like for you to be involved in this very unique transition team.
All right, so I get to I was President-elect Trump's first hire, one of his first hires. So I go to Trump Tower, and I go in, and I see, you know, there are like 20 people there. And I said, well, where is everybody? You know, transitions, I'm used to transitions, and there's thousands of people. Where are they all? Well, it turned out there weren't any. And so then I sat down with the guy who'd been designated chief of staff, Reince Priebus. And I said, okay, so how's this going to work? I know how the National Security Council works. And do you realize that, and I said this even to Mike Flynn, I said, you know, the National Security Council isn't just the president's foreign policy aid. It runs an entire U.S. bureaucracy of the foreign policy bureaucracy. Well, they were stunned. They didn't know any of that. So I thought, oh boy, these guys really don't know anything. They have just pulled off the greatest political defeat or victory in American history. and they don't know what happens next. They didn't think they were going to win. They don't have a transition team. So I start talking to the handful of people. Eric Trump was one of my good friends, and so I was talking to him. I talked to Jared Kushner, Mike Flynn, Steve Bannon, and I realized, whoa, these guys have no idea, how it works. So I take a yellow legal pad, Elizabeth, and I say, let me just sketch out the West Wing for you. Here's the Oval Office. Here's the Chief of Staff's office. Here's the Vice President's office. Here's the National Security Advisor. Here's the press office. And that's kind of all there is. And, it's not very big. It's very cohesive, but it's the most powerful couple of square feet in the country.
Amazing.
And so anyway, so the long and short of it was that they really weren't sure how to do it. And I thought, besides being a little chaotic, it was actually a very good thing. Really? Because had they come into office like every administration does, they would have just hired the same old. And as Trump says, you hire the same people, you get the same policies. So it was really important, even though it was complicated and chaotic, and I'm sure it seemed very chaotic to the outside. But it was important to do that. Otherwise, you would have had just the same old that had been such a failure for 20 years.
Right. And you describe them almost like, there's just a revolving door, right? It's one establishment steps out, the next establishment steps in, and then the next administration, it happens again. And this threw everyone for a loop, right? Because you were one of the few who was really, you've been there through so many administrations, but the rest of them, they didn't get these jobs. It was actually different people who had never been in the West Wing, never even worked in Washington. So the chaos, you can feel it in the book. When you're reading the book, you can feel that level of chaos. And when you talked about describing the West Wing and even telling them what the jobs were in each of these offices. And it's just an amazing thing. So during this time, KT, is when General Flynn found himself in a situation that later, of course, haunted him. It's really in detail in the book, and I want people to go read about it because it gives them insight. But let's give them a summary of what happened during that. Before, of course, the inauguration, there was a phone call between General Flynn and the Russian ambassador. How do we set that up for people so they understand what really happened there?
Okay, well, in any presidential transition, the new team gets in touch, especially the foreign policy people. They talk to all the foreign leaders because you don't want on day one, you don't want the first crisis and you're trying to figure out, wait, who's the foreign minister of this country? You want to establish a relationship. So General Flynn and I both went and we kind of divided the world up. I did Asia because I was a China expert by training. And he did Russia because he had a relationship, and he did the Middle East because he had fought in the Middle East. And so during the transition, he's talking to the Russians, I'm talking to the Chinese, and no big deal. He was talking to them. There was a moment at which the outgoing Obama administration imposed sanctions on Russia.
Right.
I didn't think it was any big deal. We didn't want a crisis with Russia for sure. Right. But General Flynn had a pretty innocuous phone call with the Russian ambassador. Didn't think a whole lot of it. We're in the White House. All of a sudden, there's this drumbeat of leaks coming from the intelligence community implying that General Flynn had done something very wrong by talking to the Russian ambassador. President Trump was asked, well, what about it? And he said, well, of course he had to talk to the Russian ambassador. He was just doing his job.
Right.
Well, this is now week 3 into the Trump administration, and the public affairs officer of the National Security Council comes into my office, closes the door, and says, we have a big problem. I said, what's the problem? And he said, the Washington Post has just called, and they have a transcript of the phone call between General Flynn and the Russian ambassador. And they talked about sanctions, which the Democrats are claiming was a violation of rules. You can only have one president at one time, and Flynn shouldn't have talked about that. And I said, transcript, wait a minute. Who is wiretapping the president's national security advisor without our knowledge? And what the heck does the Washington Post have a copy of this thing? I don't know anything about this phone. I know about the phone call, but I don't know about a transcript of this. So what the heck? Anyway, long and short of it, General Flynn gets fired on the basis of that. And the whole Russia investigation starts. And it turns out that, as I suspected all along, the Russia investigation was a complete fraud. It was a complete hoax. It was a way for the intelligence community, the political people at the top of the intelligence community, and the FBI to try to do in the Trump administration. So as I reflect now back on it, it was hard to kind of go through it at the time. It was pretty scary.
Yeah.
But I look back on it and I realized that what this was the establishment, the guys who've been in charge in Washington, always have been in charge in Washington, and
Yeah.
they saw Donald Trump as a major threat. So they had to get rid of him one way or another. And at the time, I thought maybe I'm being a little bit of a conspiracy theorist, but now, of course, it's been shown by the records and notes that a lot of these senior officials of the FBI and the intelligence community and the Justice Department, by their own handwritten notes and
Right.
transcripts, that they, in fact, they knew that there was nothing there. They kind of made it all up as a way of getting at Trump.
Now we know all of that, and they use this obscure Logan Act. I think it was from 1799 to go, to go after Flynn. Now the story, unfortunately for you, doesn't end there. And in the book, you describe what happens, after Flynn is fired, and then there's a transition for you, and there's talk of the Singapore ambassadorship, and sort of all this time for you until you move on from there. But then all of a sudden, many months later. The full
many months later, Elizabeth,
right.
I'm in Long Island in Southampton, where my husband and I live. Our 5 wonderful children are all grown. They're gone. And I come home from the gym early one morning in late August of 2017. And my husband left to go run some errands. And so I'm sitting there with my, exercise clothes on, and my cell phone rings. So I say, this isn't a very good connection. Eastern Long Island isn't very good. Who's calling? And the guy, I understood FBI. I said, look, bad connection. Can you send me an email? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, we're right outside your door. Can we come in? So here I am all alone. And I realized later that they had waited for me to be all alone. And they come in and said, well, we just want to, we're part of the Mueller investigation. We just want to ask you a few questions because we're investigating Russian interference. And I said, well, I care more than anybody about how the Russians did whatever it was they did. I want to get to the bottom of it too. But I said, but do I need a lawyer? Am I under some kind of an investigation? Oh no, no. You're a fact. We just want you to give us a sense of what happened and how it happened. And so, and I kept saying, look, I'm going only from memory. These questions you're asking me, I don't have my records.
Right.
I'm the ultimate Girl Scout. I turned in all my cell phones and my logs and my email text. I don't have anything. I'm just going from memory. And they say, oh, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Anyway, long and short of it is about 8 hours later, we're finished, and I'd given them everything I could think of.
Yeah.
And always with the caveat that it might be incorrect, but that it was not intentional. And with their reassurance that, oh, you're not under any investigation, everything's fine. And then a month later, and then a month later after that, and then it became very clear that they were trying to find me guilty of something.
Right.
And to the point where when I didn't get a lawyer at first, I asked former Attorney General Mike Mukasey, who's one of my husband's best friends. I said, Mike Mukasey, do I need a lawyer? And he said, no, this is just a simple mess. No. And I asked the head of Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the big New York law firms. No, you don't need a lawyer. Well, of course I wouldn't have needed a lawyer, except for the fact that these guys the Mueller investigation was looking to trick people in process crimes. So they were trying to trick you if you got the date wrong of something.
Right.
And so it was really, it was horrible, because how could they do that? Where they controlled all the files of myself, General Flynn, other people, and they wouldn't let you see anything. But it's like they had the answer code, and they were quizzing you to say, when you had that phone call on Tuesday, what did you discuss?
Right.
You think, well, I'm not. And if you got it Tuesday wrong and it turns out Wednesday, they would jump up and say, well, we're going to charge you with perjury. I mean, they don't say it in those words, but that's the implication. So long and short of this horrible process was that it made it pretty clear to me that they either wanted me to plead guilty to a crime I didn't commit, which was lying to the FBI, or they wanted me to implicate President Trump in crimes he didn't commit, and I wouldn't do it. And it was the most horrible thing, because at one point I'm sitting in my lawyer's office, head of Sullivan and Cromwell, and I said, what do they want? I mean, they've got subpoenas. We've been 30 hours.
Horrible.
And they said, well, they're just going to, you're not giving them the narrative they want.
Yeah.
And I turned to my husband and I said, oh, maybe what do they want me to say? I'll just say it to make this done.
Katie.
Wow. And Alan said, well, you've met him. I mean, and he said, no, you can't live with yourself if you lie. And I said, but they're going to bankrupt us because we have to pay all these legal fees ourselves. It's millions of dollars.
It's
and he said, no.
Incredible. You can't, though. You did nothing wrong. I mean,
Yeah.
Again, the book, the way you write it, I started to get I thought I was getting a rash. I was getting so stressed out from reading your book because it was this description again and again where they're lying to you, frankly, and telling you, no, it's okay. And you keep saying, I believe them, and then giving you redacted emails and pieces of information and trying to find this perjury, set a perjury trap for you. And of course, it was a nothing burger. But the end of that, you were so, I think it sounded exhausted and so overwhelmed by what they did. You guys literally had to leave the country.
I mean, General Flynn, under that kind of pressure, General Flynn did plead guilty to a crime he didn't commit.
Right.
I didn't.
Right.
And then, at a certain point, they realized, well, she's not going to give us what we want. We're done with her. But I was so devastated after 6 months of this that my husband, who's retired, and he just said, you got to get your feet back under yourself.
Yeah.
And so we left the country that night.
Yeah.
And we took an overnight flight to Scotland, and we went to the most remote part of the west coast of Scotland, where there are no cars, there's no Wi-Fi, there are no telephones, there's no TV, there's no nothing.
Yeah.
And we just stayed there for a couple of months, and just to sort of get my head together, because I was so upset. What had happened to me? What had this brilliant career in life? It was now gone.
Right.
But what was happening to my country? Are the leaders of my country doing this sort of thing? How can this happen in America?
It's shocking. It's shocking. You had the full weight of the U.S. government come against you. And by the way, everyone, there is no one paying this bill for KT. When the government comes after you, it's your lawyers, and it was for nothing. And even the ambassadorship to Singapore, everything went away. It was too much. And I just, I want to say I apologize on behalf of our state senator in New Jersey who did not treat you well. And this is not the swan song for someone like you who has done amazing things for this country. But yes, this is what we've been facing. Now, the book talks about that whole process, which is tremendous to read about, but also shocking. And then you get into sort of, why, what's going to happen now with Trump. Now, the book, let's be clear to everyone, was written before the height of the pandemic and before the election, and certainly before January 6th and the second impeachment. So I said to you before we went live, I'd like to see you write another chapter because I think your viewpoint is so powerful. What would you say now that you've seen what's happened in this last 12 months, including the pandemic, the election, January 6th, the second impeachment? What do you think now of everything?
Well, one of the things that I concluded when I did go off into the wilderness of the Hebridean Islands and the west coast of Scotland is that America was going through a revolution, a political revolution. Right. And I realized that we're supposed to have political revolutions, and we do. We have them periodically. And it was a gift that the founding fathers gave us. They understood the nature of man and the nature of government was always going to be to acquire more power and to take it away from others, and that was going to be America. Any government was going to be that. But yet the American people, because we're a society that's so dynamic and so changing, technologically, ethnically, geographically, every other way, that we would be constantly changing and government would never keep up. So they gave us the ballot box and the electoral college and all. They gave us a system to have a political revolution every 40 years. And with enormous regularity, we have done it. So we did it. We overthrew the British. And the revolution. And then Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, he overthrew the sort of ruling class of Washington. And then in the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln and what came like overthrew the ruling class. Teddy Roosevelt in the Industrial Revolution. Again, the ruling class wasn't able to get it done. So we go through these periodic things. And I think that's what we're going through now, is that Trump started a new American revolution. Reagan had done one 40 years prior. Trump started one, but he didn't finish it.
Yes.
Because he never got a second term. So I think that those forces are still there in America today. It's still the populists versus the elitists. And the elitists, the Biden administration is really, it's the return of it's like in the Star Wars trilogies, the Empire Strikes Back. The Empire is back in charge.
Right.
All the guys are back in power, and they're going to show the stupid people like us how to really do things.
That's right.
Look, the Biden administration is Jimmy Carter 2.0.
Wow.
It's going to be a complete failure. Okay. Jimmy Carter, by the way, is a side note to all the young people in your audience.
Yes.
Jimmy Carter was elected after Watergate.
Yes.
And he was hailed at the time in 1976, hailed as a great leader, was going to unify the country, bring morality back to American governance. And yet within 2 years, he had so screwed up that the economy was so bad that we had to create a new word. It was called stagflation. It's because we had really high inflation, a stagnant economy, high unemployment because of his dopey economic policies. And then we had a bad foreign policy where he was being pushed around by then the Soviet Union and, interestingly, Iran. So I think that Joe Biden, he's Jimmy Carter 2.0. The economy is going to be a disaster within 2 years. And the Chinese are going to really push us around, and probably Iran and Russia and all those little pipsqueak countries. But I think that within 2 years, the country's going to say, wait a minute, these experts, they're back. They're just as bad as ever.
Bad as ever.
Bad as ever. And so I think you'll see a Republican, if we get the right Republicans.
Right ones.
Republicans take the House and the Senate in 2022, when I think that potentially the White House in 2024 with the right candidate.
Yeah, and that's our hope. And you know, I can't believe this half an hour is almost up, but as we wind down, part of our hope, I want you to brag on your daughter a little bit, because, you know, you say getting the right Republicans, and here you have a daughter who recently ran and is in now the House in Florida. Talk about Fiona, because this gives us all hope that we have people like that, the future of our party. So talk about her race and what she's doing. Okay, so I have 5 kids, and as you just said, and so the middle child, Fiona, oldest daughter, she went to the Naval Academy. She's a naval officer, and she went to business school, got a business degree, had this really high-flying business career as a consultant at McKinsey. And she decided about 2 years ago, she said, I just, you know, I love making the money, but I really miss the notion of service. So I want to run for public office. And her husband, who was a classmate from the Naval Academy, they had relocated to Florida, where he's from. And so she decided she was going to run for the Florida State House of Representatives, not for Congress, but she, and I think she's right, the action, the real innovations are going to come out of the state houses, not in Washington, D.C. Agreed.
So she runs from Sarasota, Florida, and in the middle of her campaign, she's pregnant. And so Granny comes down to help take care of the baby while she goes out and campaigns. And she did it the old-fashioned way. I mean, she walked door to door, knocking on doors, and it's 95 degrees humidity, 95 degrees heat. It was horrible. And she just took a Democrat district and she flipped it to Republican. She flipped it. That is the story. She flipped it. By 10 points. By 10 points. I love it. I love it. So, and because of her, I got to know a lot of people who were running for state legislatures around the country. And what I realized in the 2020 election, put aside who won the presidency, but in every state, in every House of Representatives, in every state Senate, who won? It was people with the Trump policy, America First, Make America Great Again, pro-growth, pro-economic policies, you know, energy independent. They won. And so the country's not nuts. No. The country doesn't want the cancel culture and the woke media. That's not the rest of the country. So I have enormous confidence and hope. And she's only been in office for a couple of months, but Governor DeSantis in Florida has asked my daughter, Fiona McFarland, freshman, to lead the most important piece of legislation, which is the data privacy legislation that Florida is leading. So it's states like Florida, and there are a few others that are way ahead of Washington. They're going to actually get stuff done. The new crop of Republicans, they're young, they're female, they're Asian, they're Hispanic, they're Black, they're everything. And they're really committed to the policies that we know work. So I'm actually quite excited about what the future holds because of that next generation. Yeah, and as you should be. And tell Fiona we're just so proud of her and what Florida is doing to lead the way. Washington's not getting it done. So Florida, the states have to do it. And that's our hope. Coming from a blue state, we're looking at the red states, just hoping that people like Fiona can really make a difference. And obviously she carries you know, your spirit with her, and it's an incredible legacy. You've inspired so many women. You blew through so many glass ceilings. And it's not a surprise that she's doing the same thing. So everybody, I want you to, I could talk to you for an hour, but I want you to get KT's book. It's amazing. Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People. It will give you such an insight as to what's really going on and what really happened. And obviously we have a lot of hope for the future, KT. So
as we wrap up, I just want you to give everybody kind of a shot in the arm and hope that this sort of darkness that's descended on us, that there is that future, because our country always comes back. You said in the book that, you know, the American people, I have confidence that they will ultimately prevail. So give us that last bit of hope.
Let me just tell you that the night Richard Nixon resigned, I was in the White House Situation Room, and I was in tears. I thought, oh gosh, you know, all the great things that we had done, foreign policy and economic policy, it's all going to be for naught. And it was, the Republican Party was over. I figured my career was over.
Yeah.
And yet within 5 or 6 years, Ronald Reagan was back in the White House, and he led a real revolution. So I think that you have to go through these periods. They're cathartic. I mean, America, you know, it's not easy to have a revolution, or we'd have them all the time. They're hard. And the people who are in power, they fight like mad to keep their jobs. So I think what's really going to be important is groups like yours. It's going to be the people who are going to go door to door. It's the people who are going to encourage their neighbors to vote, who are going to get involved in the school board meetings and the town councils. It's not happening in Washington.
Nope.
It's happening in grassroots around the country.
Amen.
And that's why what you're doing and the groups that you're affiliated with, you're going to make the difference. It's like a little bit at a time. But, you know, cumulatively, it changes the world.
You're speaking to my heart. I say that all the time. You know, everything is on the street. It's your next door neighbor. It's your town. It's your, you want to make a difference, not Washington. They literally have fences around Washington. It is a literal example of how we're no longer able to make change there right now, but we can do it. KT, you're amazing. Thank you for giving us so much time and blessing my audience. And just on behalf of all Americans, especially women, you are a treasure, and we appreciate all the sacrifices you have made. And you are a part of our history. You are woven in the history of our country. So again, I salute you and thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I really appreciate you doing this in the COVID era, to really continue to keep keep us all in touch with each other. Thank you.
We have to do that. And everybody go to Amazon, get her book. I'm telling you, it is an amazing read. And we'll look for maybe an updated version coming out in a few months with further wisdom from KT. KT, thank you again.
Thanks you so much, Elizabeth. Bye-bye.
And to my audience, guys, we'll see you next week.